Hi, I'm Carl Franklin. This is the 7th part of a multi-part series on building a podcast client app with Xamarin Forms. In part 6, we started work on a playlist feature. We let the user create and delete playlists, which are persisted to storage. In this episode, we'll write the code to add podcast episodes to a playlist and remove them as well. And that requires a couple new features, so it's not going to be a quick show. But I promise you're going to love it. Managing playlist episodes is coming right up on the .NET Show. All right, we're starting this week with a couple of bug fixes. The first bug fix is in Playlist Manager Page View Model. And if you scroll down to the bottom to delete playlist, you'll see that we're actually getting the file name from the existing file .name, when actually it's keyed off the ID. So there's the bug right there. The file wasn't being deleted. The second bug is actually in .NET Rocks iOS in App Delegate. And down in Finish Launching, we need to add this line of code here. DevExpress Xamarin Forms Collection View iOS Initializer init. Yep, that's right. We never actually initialized it for iOS, which is necessary. And there's another initialize as well that's required, which is up in the .NET Rocks project, and it's in the constructor. And we're just going to do the same kind of thing, but DevExpress Xamarin Forms Collection View Initializer, not iOS, init. So without those two init pieces of code, the iOS version of the app didn't work. Sorry about that. I actually went back into the previous repos and fixed it. So let's look at the user stories that we've created so far. These right here. As a user, I want to create a new playlist and give it a name. Done. As a user, I want the app to automatically persist my playlists. Done. As a user, I want to be able to retrieve a playlist from the list of playlists I've created. Done. And as a user, I want to delete an existing playlist. Done. Especially with today's code. Now today, we're going to deal with the next two. I want to select one or more episodes to add to a playlist, and I want to be able to remove episodes from my playlist. That's it. That's all we're doing today. So there are over 1,700 shows in the archives. And if we were to select shows to add to a playlist, we probably want to be able to filter them by the title based on an input string. So we're going to add an episode filter to the application. And to start that, let's start at API service, which is in the services folder. We're going to add a method called getFilteredShows. And here it is. So this calls into the API to get a set of shows where the title contains the show title, case insensitive, and then returns just a subset of the result set up to count items starting at start index. So we're passing the show name, which we pass for every API call, the show title, the start index, the count, and the string getFilteredShows. Now the API is already set up to handle this. So we're just really adding this to our project in order to be able to access it. Next, let's go to Home Page View Model, and we'll add the following code. An episode filter property. So we just got a string episode filter. When we set that episode filter, we're going to set the last show number to 0. And if you recall, last show number keeps track of the highest show number that we've retrieved so that when we go to get the next batch of shows, we can start at last show number plus 1. So what we're going to do is bind this property to an entry element in the UI, which is on the web the equivalent of an input tag. And whenever the user enters a key, the set code here will execute. And basically we're calling get next batch of shows But first, in order for this to work dynamically, we have to change this all shows property from a list of show to an observable collection of show. And of course, we have to qualify that namespace. Next, we're going to add another method called getNextBatch of filtered shows. Yes, I know we have an error here. We'll get to that in a second. So this gets the next batch from getFilteredShows, passing the episode filter, which is the property we're bound to. Now, if you recall, the next argument is the start index. So all shows count will be the start index. Remember, all shows is a observable collection. It's 0 base, so count will be the next one, the start index. And we're only going to retrieve 20. Notice that we have to add the shows one at a time here. And that's because observable collection doesn't have an add range method. So here's where we're going to make the magic happen, right down here in getNextBatchOfShows. We're going to add this code to the top. If episode filter does not equal an empty string, we're going to clear all shows. And then we're going to call getNextBatchOfFilteredShows and get the heck out of here. Now, we're getting an error on this add range because, of course, the observable collection does not have an add range method, as I said before. So we'll change this to what we did up top, which is add them one at a time. All right, so that takes care of the view model. Now let's go to the view. So here's homepage XAML. And we're going to add the filter right below this main label that says .NET Rocks Podcast Client in the stack layout, right there. So here we have a horizontal stack layout with a little margin on the left. We have a large font size label, black, that says filter. And then next to that, we have an entry, which is for text input. Got some options to horizontally start and expand. And we're going to vertically align this to the center, just like we did up here, so that they both line up together. We're just giving it a width request of 200 to be safe. And we're binding the text property to episode filter. So let's give it a go. All right. So let's tap the filter input box and type something like Azure. And guess what? We see the first 20 episodes where the title contains the word Azure. How cool is that? And let's go down to the bottom of this list because we have definitely more than 20 shows that have Azure in the title. And if we load more shows, now we've got 40. And if there's less than 20 that come back when we load more shows, no big deal. We just get the rest of them. All right, let's talk about playlist management behavior. We're going to talk through how we want this flow to work. So this is what our playlist manager looks like with one playlist defined. And if you don't remember, we did this last week. So you can see here that we've got the playlist name, the number of shows in the playlist, and then the date and time that it was created, and we have a delete button. So to the left of the delete button, we're going to add an add remove button over here. Add remove. That'll bring us back to the home page, which will pass the ID of the selected playlist, which the home page will then retrieve from storage. The home page will retrieve the playlist from storage. And for each show, the home page will either show a select button or show a remove button to the left of the episode details button. So it's going to be one or the other. If it's already in the playlist, you'll see a remove button. If it's not in the playlist, you'll see a select button. After selecting a show, it will be added to the playlist shows list. Select will change to remove, and then you can tap remove to remove it from the shows playlist. So let's add a command to the playlist manager page view model. Add remove. And it's going to be an async command passing a GUID to perform add remove, which is right down here. So here we're going to use shell navigation to go to the home page, and we're passing playlist ID as a parameter, just like we would pass parameters to a website. Question mark, parameter name equals parameter value. And the GUID is passed as a string, because when we use this $, all the variables that we put in here render their toString method. So let's go to the Playlist Manager page XAML view, and we're going to add the following just above the delete button in the horizontal stack layout that contains the delete button. So here's our add remove button, and our command is the add remove command on the view model, which we're bound to. And then because it's the view model, we have to specify that as the source. And the reason for that, again, is because the current binding context is the collection view, which is the particular item in the playlist. So here you can just say binding name, shows count, because that's the show in this particular binding context. But if we want to reach back to the Playlist Manager view model, we have to specify the source this way. Have I mentioned I really can't wait for MAUI, and I can do all this with Blazor? Just putting that out there. All right, now we're going to add some stuff to the home page view model. First of all, I'm going to add a few using statements right here, because we haven't used Xamarin Essentials and Monkey Cache file store and Newtonsoft JSON System Web. We haven't used those here in the home page yet. So let's go to the top level variables here, and we'll add cache dir. And since we need to load the playlist from storage, we have to modify this constructor to use the barrel application ID and also set the cache directory. So here's that. Barrel.application ID equals mobile_DNR. And the cache dir is the file system, which comes from Xamarin Essentials, the cache directory, and then we're adding /playlists to it, because this is a new folder, a subfolder, where we want to keep all our playlists, right? And that's where the playlists are. We saw that last week. And then the rest of the code, which essentially calls get next batch of shows asynchronously, even though it's from a constructor. This is a nice little pattern to use. So now we're going to add a selected playlist property. So this is a playlist, and it's a selected playlist. We don't have to do anything special, no logic here. So we just have some lambdas to return our private selected playlist. And in the setter, we're calling set property, which is in the base class, and passing in selected playlist with the value. Next, we need to implement the iQuery attributable interface so we can receive that parameter value that we're passing. So I'm going to go up to the top here and add this interface that we need to implement. And of course, you can hover over it and drop down, select implement interface, and boom. Now at least we have a little skeleton for that. So if you scroll about halfway down, you'll see this apply query attributes. All right, so here's what we're doing. This query right here is a dictionary or an iDictionary of string, meaning the key is a string and the value is a string. So if there's nothing in it, we don't have a selected playlist. So set it to null. No query, no ID, no parameter, no playlist. Boom. Next, we're assuming that there is a playlist ID query in here, because actually we wrote the code to do that. It's not like a website where you can put in your own input and navigate yourself by typing in the browser. So we're decoding that from the query and getting the ID. And now we have the file name, which we're creating from the cache dir /id.json. And if the file exists, we're reading that JSON into a string and then deserializing that into a playlist, and that is our selected playlist. So now let's add a command for the select button to execute. So here it is right here. Select show for playlist. And this is going to be an async command of int, because the primary key for a show is an integer. Now this is async, and I said it before, I like to have async methods set up even though there's no async code, because if I do need to call something asynchronously, I don't have to change everything. So this is a little line of code that I put in there to appease the compiler. And it doesn't do anything. So we're performing select show for playlist. So we've got our select button to add this show to the selected playlist. So therefore, if the selected playlist is null, return. We don't expect it to be null, but you know what? This is object-oriented programming. Nulls happen. It's a fact of life. Have some sentries. Sleep well at night. So now we're checking to see if this show is already in the list of shows in playlist. And we're only going to add it if it's not there. Maybe our logic screwed up and it's there already. So just a little bit more checking. And again, you can sleep soundly at night. So we pull out the show where the ID matches, and we're calling that add this. And then we're adding this to the shows list of selected playlist. Now the rest of this code is just saving the file. We're serializing the selected playlist, creating the file name from that ID, and writing it to storage. So those 3 lines right there save the file. And then we're doing an onProperty changed of selected playlist just so that the UI can update. Next, we need to figure out whether to show the select or remove buttons because we only want to do that when the conditions are right. So let's start with the select button. First, we're going to need a value converter to accept a playlist and a show ID as a parameter and return a Boolean whether the select button should be visible. So we're going to add a class here called playlist to select button visible converter. Did I mention I really love Blazor? All right, here it is. So let's go through this. So it implements iValue converter, and here's our convert. So the value is going to be a playlist, right? So if that's null, get out. Nothing to do here. So we're casting that to a playlist, and here's how we have to pass a parameter. We have to pass a label. So why a label instead of an ID? It has to do with XAML binding. The short version is XAML gets really complicated when you need to do stuff with multiple binding contexts. And this is a good example of why the Blazor component model is much easier than XAML. I'm looking forward to rewriting this as a MAUI app using Blazor as the UI. Have I mentioned that? Have I made that clear? But this little workaround took me hours to figure out, and you'll see why in a few minutes. The label control is going to have text that will have the ID in it. So if it's null, return, get out. And if it's not null, we're going to convert it to an integer and get the ID. So now we're checking to see if the show is in the playlist shows list. And if it's not there, we're going to return true so we can show the select button. If it is there, don't show the select button, return false. All right, so now we're going to go to the home page XAML. And under the binding context, we're going to add this resource here for our value converter. And next, let's move down here and this button here for the episode details. We're going to replace this with a whole new horizontal stack layout that has multiple buttons in it. So get rid of that. And here's the new stack layout. So it's horizontal. Let me move this over here a little bit. Now we have a label that's hidden, all right? Is visible equals false. And the text property is bound to the ID. Here's our select button. Here's our command. And I've sort of exploded this a little bit so it's a little bit easier to understand. Here we have the button is visible property, and we have the binding underneath that. This is just another way to be more explicit in XAML instead of trying to jam everything on one line. So we're binding to select show for playlist. Now this is on the view model, right? So our binding source for this button is already established right here. It's the view model. Now we're binding is visible to the selected playlist property using the value converter. The kicker is that you can't bind the converter parameter directly. You can't use binding. So we can't say converter parameter equals binding ID. But we can use this reference. And the reference is hidden ID. So there it is. That's the name of this label. So the converter parameter we have to pass to this label, the text of which is bound to the ID. And this is the kind of thing that drives me nuts about XAML. But there it is. That's how you get around it. And now below is the episode details button. So we need to do one more thing. When we navigate to the playlist manager page, we need to tell the view to refresh the playlist property so it will reload from storage. So to the playlist manager page view model, we're going to add this, refresh playlists. So we're going to create a new one. We're going to get all the files in the cache dir that are .json. That's the playlist directory. And for each one of these, we're going to read the text, the JSON into a string, deserialize that, and add it to the list. So no big deal. We're just refreshing it. Now we're going to go to the code behind for the playlist manager page. And you remember our good friend on appearing? Well, after we set the page on the view model, we're going to call refresh playlists. All right, let's give it a go. All right, so we'll go to the playlist manager page. We'll add a new playlist, call it Azure. For Azure stuff, now I'm going to hit the add remove button. That brings us back to the main page. Now I can do a filter and say Azure. And each of these I can now select. And you notice the select button goes away because that value converter says that this should not be shown because our is visible is bound to that value. So now I've got 3 shows in that playlist. And if I go back, you can see I've got 3 shows. Okay, next, the remove feature. So let's start in the view model with the remove command. And again, that's on the home page view model. And this is going to be an async command also passing an int, which is going to map to perform remove show from playlist. So that passes the show ID. It's pretty simple. We're checking to see if it's already there in the shows. And if it's not there, if it's null, we can't remove it because it's not there. But if it isn't null, we can. Here's removing it from the shows list and then saving the file and updating the property, selected playlist. So let's do the same thing for the remove button that we did for the select button, which is to create a value converter to let us know whether or not we should show the remove button. Playlist to remove button visible converter. So again, this is going to tell us whether or not to show the remove button. So the playlist is passed in as the value, right? We're taking the parameter, casting that to a label, getting the text, converting that to an int ID, seeing if it's already in the playlist shows list, and if it's there, we can show the remove button. And if it's not there, don't show the remove button. So it's kind of the opposite of the select value converter. Now let's go to the home page and we're going to add that value converter to our resources. Playlist to remove button visible converter. And then we're going to add the remove button to this stack layout just after the select button. So that's in between the select button and the episode details button right here. And there we go. So here's the remove button. We're binding this to remove show from playlist on the view model, passing the ID, and our is visible is bound to the selected playlist through the converter to see if the remove button is visible. And the parameter, again, is the reference to the hidden label, which is up here, passing the ID. And again, this is on the view model, so we have to bind it to the view model. So that should be it. Let's test it out. Do some selecting and removing. All right, let's go to our playlist manager. Here's our Azure playlist. Here we go, add remove. We're going to, again, select Azure through the filter. And you can see this one is already in there, so we can remove it. Boom. And now the select button shows up, the remove button goes away. And then here's remove because these first three were added in there, and everything else is select. Let's go back and see if the remove worked. Yep, 2. Let's close this and run it again and see if we still have 2. Yep, we do. There are 2 shows in the Azure playlist. And that's where we're going to leave it this week. Next week, we'll get into implementing the playlist. In other words, we're going to have a play button right here that will go through each of these shows and play them in order. And that's coming up next week. Hey, thanks for watching. See you next time. Thanks for watching. Please visit blazertrain.com and the .NETshow.com for more great content.